Hey there guys, welcome to Tech Engineered. Last week we talked about hard drives, so this week we're going to talk about solid state drives and see if I can give you some ideas of what to look for in a solid state drive. So stay tuned. So last week we started off with the topic of which is better, solid state drive or hard drive. So I'm just going to kind of recap that real quick. Basically, a solid state drive is going to be a drive that works much like an SD card, only on a larger scale with a higher capacity. And it's basically a bunch of chips that store data electronically and not magnetically like a hard drive. So it does read a lot faster because you're talking about electron transfers being your read and writes, so you're getting closer to the speed of light with your transfers. Whereas a hard drive is reading magnetic data and it's having to translate it, and it's going to be a lot slower. If you want to go for high capacity, definitely go with a hard drive. If you want to go for speed, go with a solid state drive, because a hard drive still is much cheaper to get a larger capacity. The next thing to consider is the interface that the SSD works off of. There are multiple of them. You can get a PCI Express, where it fits in much like a graphics card. You can get an M.2, which will still be PCI Express, but it'll be a different kind of slot, a little tiny slot that is on your motherboard. Or you can get SATA, where it hooks up much like a hard drive. Now the fastest that's out there is the PCI Express, where it just plugs in and it can have as many PCI Express lanes as it wants, well, up to 16. Usually they take up like 8 though, or less, but that's generally the fastest. M.2 is also very, very fast, although a lot of the PCI Express SSDs will beat out the M.2s, but the M.2s are nice because it's just a tiny little chip that fits into the motherboard, and it makes life a whole lot easier because it doesn't take up much space, doesn't use any cables, whereas if you have a SATA SSD, which hooks up like a hard drive, you have 2 cables running to it. If you have PCI Express, it takes up a lot of space. So an M.2 is really kind of like what I would recommend. If your motherboard has an M.2 slot, use that because it just simplifies things and makes things a whole lot easier. No cables, it doesn't take up space or any slots. It does take up PCI Express lanes because usually M.2s will either be 2 lanes or 4 lanes PCI Express, but I think it is definitely worth it to just get the M.2 and put it in there, and then you can basically forget about it because it basically becomes part of the motherboard once you get it in the slot and screw it in. So that's kind of my recommendation. Not all motherboards have an M.2 slot, so definitely take a look at that and see if you can do that. Otherwise, just a standard SATA SSD works fine, or the PCI Express ones are kind of expensive, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend those unless you know that you need just a super fast SSD, but for like price per gig and price per speed, they're not the best. They are the best speed-wise, but they're going to be really outrageous, so try and get an M.2 if you can. If not, a SATA will work fine. The next thing to consider is the capacity. Generally, I wouldn't recommend going below like 128 gigs, just because you want room for your Windows operating system, maybe the recovery partition for Windows, and your most used applications and stuff like that, maybe some files that you need to read off of, maybe set some programs to cache on the SSD, like an editing program or something like that, to where you can get faster performance in those. And you need some space for that. You can go down to like 60 gigs. 60 gigs will work for some people, but most people will run out of space really quickly once they get the operating system, some applications, maybe a couple Steam games on there, and then you're just done. So I would definitely recommend sticking above 128, and generally, if you're going to have a hard drive in it, you don't want to go above 512, just because if you have a hard drive, there's not much that you're going to need at that high speed other than just operating system and a couple other things. So the hard drive will handle most of the storage, so you don't want to go too high and spend a bunch of money on something that you won't necessarily use. Now, if you don't have a hard drive, I'd recommend going up to even a terabyte of SSD space if you can fit it into your budget, and just running off of one SSD, because that is now a viable option, because the terabyte SSDs have come down quite a bit in price to where you can, if you can work off of 1 terabyte, you can just have an SSD in your computer. So take that into account when you're trying to figure out what capacity you want. Definitely take a look and see if you're planning on doing a hard drive or not, and that will kind of lead you to where your capacity should go on your solid state drive. The next thing to consider is whether the drive supports NVMe. NVMe is basically just a memory controller type, and basically it's just a really fast storage controller that will increase your speeds and stuff. I would recommend getting it because if you get an NVMe drive, then it's going to be just a lot faster. If you don't, I mean, it's not going to be super slow, but it's worth it just to look and see. NVMe drives will cost quite a bit more than just like kind of a generic solid state drive, but if you can, definitely try and get NVMe because it's just going to increase your speeds, and it's not that expensive to get an NVMe drive over just a generic regular memory controlled drive, try and get that. Look for it on the box of the SSD and see if you can fit an NVMe drive into your budget, and you'll be pretty good if you can do that. The next thing that I wanted to talk about was the different uses for a solid state drive and what you can use it for. Most people will be using it for a boot drive, putting their operating system on it and getting faster boot speeds and putting some applications on it and stuff like that, which I think is the best use for it. You can also use it for storage. So you might put your operating system on your hard drive and just use your solid state drive for storage for all the stuff that you need to run faster, like games and stuff like that. Another use for it is to use it as a cache, to where you don't really put things on it, but a lot of applications such as DaVinci Resolve, which I use as my editor, will let you like set a cache drive so that it will have faster storage for its cached files that it's going to need really fast when you're editing. You can use it for either of those three uses, as a boot drive, storage drive, or cache. Generally, I recommend using it as a boot drive unless you're big into video editing and stuff like that, then you might want to use it as cache. Storage, I would only do that if you're really big into PC games and you just want to have a dedicated like Steam library basically on that SSD so you get faster load screen times and stuff like that. Just take those things into consideration, that there are different uses for SSDs, and you might get multiple SSDs for all the different uses. You can have 3 and have a boot SSD, storage SSD, and a cache SSD. But just take into account that you can use them for different purposes and figure out which purposes are right for you. I hope this video has helped you with your SSD selection process, and if you did enjoy this video, go ahead and leave a like on it. If you like the content on this channel in general, go ahead and subscribe. If you have advice for future content that I can make on the channel, go ahead and leave that down in the comments section below. I will see you guys in the next video.